lingering stuff from last week?
Was last week's discussion posted?
No, it's still on the thing. Nobody. I'm going to give it to Andrew today, and
Thank you.
he's all over it.
Did you mean to plug in your laptop?
No, I don't need you yet.
Okay.
I just didn't know where the battery was when I picked it up. All right. Good. No questions. I'm sure there'll be a lot of them. All right. So today we are. Did you guys hear an echo?
No.
I felt a little bit like that when I was there earlier.
All right. So today we're going to talk about philosophical psychology, which often kind of throws people for a loop because they're like, okay, what do you mean by philosophical psychology? Because we're all familiar with psychology. So just to make the distinction, we'll call it clinical psychology and philosophical psychology. And as you can imagine, where would clinical psychology get its first principles as a science from?
Philosophical psychology.
Yeah. So going back to what we talked about last week about sciences and how they kind of build upon each other and how, and so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what the first principles of psychology, at least modern day psychology, should be, although they aren't necessarily that way. So I'm not a person who is, you'll often run into this, I think. There's two things that you'll kind of take away. I'm not a person who is like overly critical of like modern psychology because it does serve a purpose. But I think that that it's important that we don't just accept it whole cloth. So in other words, if you were to ask a bunch of psychotherapists, what is mental health, right? Which is the goal, right? Mental health. That would be probably disqualify many of them, right? Because their definition of mental health wouldn't kind of harken back to what we really understand to be when someone is thinking clearly, because from right thought comes right action, right? And then there's also just this tendency to equate the natural and the normal. So where something that is natural for mankind and is good, it's often substituted with the normal. What everyone else is doing, what the norm is. And so as you talk to people who are seeing psychologists or need a psychologist yourself, that would be my first question for them. Like, how do you define mental health, right? Because if I went to like an orthopedist and I was like, okay, what would you say health of my knee is? And he's like, oh, just walk around with crutches, or there's a lot of people with limps. It's fine. So that would be the way to sort of qualify versus disqualify. Okay, so I don't want to spend like a whole lot of time talking about that. What I want to talk about is the Thomistic sort of understanding of the human person, in particular the soul. And so that's what we'll do. All right, and then things will come out of it, but we'll pretty much we have all semester long just talk about the positive aspect, and then we can talk about the things that differ from it slightly, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. All right, so definition. All right, so we're really dealing with sort of a distinction that St. Thomas would have made. So he would have, most of what we would talk about today, he would call anthropology, okay, rather than psychology. So psychology is the study of the nature, powers, and activities of vegetative, sensitive, and rational souls, and of the living beings animated by such souls. All right. So what is the material object? Yes, Conor, go ahead. Corey.
You might ask this as a question, but can you define powers?
Yeah, so all of those things, all of those, like usual, all of those terms will be defined, yes. But powers are just the innate operations of a particular thing, right? So the power of the human soul is, one of the powers is intellection, right? Reasoning. That would be a power. All right, so what is the material object? Going back to, again, getting you guys to use Thomistic terms. Or as I said last week, we're using words here. So what's the material object just in general? You guys remember what the material object is?
Study.
It's what the stuff is of it, what you're actually studying. So according to this definition, what would be
the nature's powers, activities, efficiency, sense of rational.
Yeah, so it would be living being, right? If we were just to sort of, and then the formal object would be in terms of the thing's nature, and with its the various manifestations of that nature. Okay, right, don't worry about that. That's just to sort of frame what we're saying. Yes, Casey.
So you said living being. So does that mean like there's psychology of moose?
No, what, moose? Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So notice, like last week, in fact, someone even brought up a question about, I think when we were talking about natures, about change, we were talking about someone dying, right? And I kind of just scooted the question. So everything we've talked about at this point is sort of inanimate objects, right? That's why I won't talk about the wall that I just talked about today at all. So this is more of like, there's a dividing line, right? And we talked about this last week a little bit, the dividing line between inanimate objects and animate objects.
So there's psychology of dandelions.
Yes. Yeah, because it has a nature and it has powers and it has a soul. Yes, Connor.
So when we think of psychology as the study of how, I guess what I would have said by definition walking in was the study of the mind. This applies not just to rational souls, but even to those souls which lack, that are just vegetative.
Yeah, so that's why I made like St. Thomas would call this psychology and anthropology, what we're going to do. And we'll spend most of the time talking about anthropology, but just to be clear, psychology is the study of living things. So let's define life. All right, so life is the condition of or an instance of a natural being that is alive. It's pretty obvious. That is one whose formal organizing principle enables it to be self-directed and bring about change in itself. All right, sit with that for just a second. So a living being, let's see if we can come up with, is some kind of material body, right? Whose parts. So if I look at a rock, right? If I look all throughout the rock, it looks pretty much the same, right? If I look at a dandelion, it has parts, right? But all these parts are integrated in some way so that they serve the good of the whole, right? But it's more than just. Remember we talked about this. It's more than just the sum of its parts, right? Because can you tell the difference between a dead dandelion and a live dandelion? Yes and no, right? Because it's dead at a certain point, but at the moment of death, there's not really a way to tell, right? Just like everything else. So the parts of the dandelion, there's a part to it that is essential, and that would be its form. And for the form of living beings, that form has one of the powers of the form is that it has a soul or a living thing. Yes, Connor.
So when we think about, you talk about, okay, a cell on my body is alive. Does that mean that we have a bunch of billions of little souls in each of my individual cells, or is there is it because they have no existence outside of myself? Really in meaningful existence outside of myself, that they wouldn't be said to have a soul in that sense.
Yeah, so are your cells taken away from you, or are they still alive? For a time, right? But nevertheless, we wouldn't say they have a soul, right? Because they're part of a living being, yes?
Yeah, so if you had a heart transplant or a liver transplant, you wouldn't say that you had two souls and received it from somebody else.
Right.
Is that the line that you were going?
Yeah. Yeah, so, and that, what that really means, though, is really it's not so much that the cells are alive when you take them out of the body, it's that there's a certain amount of disintegration that can happen that they can be then grafted into a living organism. But at a certain point, it's disintegrated too much. The matter itself is disintegrated too much so that it can no longer be taken to the...
So when I take out a heart, I'm only taking... There's no spiritual component of that. It's just...
No, you're taking the matter that is the heart. That's a great example, actually, what I just said. So there's a certain amount of time where the heart where it remains composed, and so that it can be put in someone else's body and serve as a heart. But still, it would get the fact that it is living comes from the fact that it's now united to a new form. Okay. All right. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So let's just talk a little bit about the conditions of life. So you have living beings are not just made, but they're born, right? So you have generation, they can die, you have corruption. And then you have what's called irritability, where they interact, they react to some kind of stimulus, okay? The other thing that they have, which goes to what it's talking about being self-directed, is they have what's called imminent activity. And that's just activity that stays within themselves, right? So when I eat something, all the activity stays within, that's an imminent activity. When I hand someone a sandwich, that is an extrinsic, or it's an imminent and eminent activity, whatever that is. But anyway, transit. I guess that would be transitive. So that's a transitive activity. All right. So all this is sort of just by way of just kind of framing what we're talking about definition-wise. Okay. All right. So Casey already asked whether plants and animals have souls. So let's talk about what a soul is, and then we can kind of dive in after one more set of definitions. All right, so do you guys remember when we talked about form and matter, right? We said certain forms depend on matter for their existence, certain forms don't. Okay? Remember that part, all right? So we have to keep in mind that distinction. All right? So anything that exists is made up of form and matter, right? A living thing has as part of its form the capacity of life. Okay, so when you say that a dandelion, you can't have a dandelion without, I'm going to use that forever, thanks, Casey. You can't have a dandelion without it being alive. Okay, if it's not alive, it's not a dandelion. So the form, what makes it what it is includes what we would call a soul. Okay. Souls themselves, okay, so I just said you can't, like I asked it, can you tell when a dog has died? You can see effects of it, right? But can I tell it right at the moment it's dead? Just like a human being, right? Like you can't necessarily, like the heart could stop beating, but it could start again. All these things, right? So what is death? How do we define death?
When the soul leaves the body.
When the soul leaves the body, and that goes across the. So why can't we measure that exactly?
Because the soul is immaterial, and all of our measurement tools can measure the material.
Okay. So does everyone understand when Sharpie says it's immaterial, what he means by that? Okay. I mean, it's a negative thing, right? So it doesn't have any matter to it, and yet it's still in the thing. Okay. It's still a part of the thing, and we'll talk about what it means for the soul to be in the body in a little bit. So what I want to, when I'm sort of going to this level, is to make the distinction between what's called a material soul and an immaterial soul, because you'll often hear material soul. Okay, plants and animals have material souls, not because they're made up of matter, but because they require matter to exist. Okay, they don't exist on their own. Man has an immaterial soul because the soul can exist separated from matter. Yes.
Why?
Why can it hold the why can man's soul exist?
Yes. And like, how does it differ?
Yeah,
from...
we're going to talk about that when we get to it. Was that your question too? All right. Yeah, and it's a good question, right? All right. So all that again is this is all just like foundational stuff. So when we talk about living things, all living things have souls. Don't be like scandalized by that. I'm not saying that animals are humans and humans are just animals. It's just the way we talk about things, okay?
So all material souls are annihilated at the moment of death. Is that correct?
Yes.
So Fido will not be in heaven.
Probably not. Probably not. So that form. So if the form depends upon the matter, and the matter begins to disintegrate, the form ceases to exist. Could it exist in? This is why I wouldn't say with 100% certainty that Fido might not exist some other time, because what does God do with the form when it goes out of existence? It can virtually still exist, right? So he could bring that form back and unite it to matter. But we don't have a reason to think he would do that. Yes, Connor. I don't want to get off on like the is my dog in heaven question.
Too deep down on the Fido question, but so Fido as a dog, he had a dog soul, and part of what Fido was is he had his matter. So
Yeah, so be more specific when you say that, because he's not just made up of his matter.
Yes, so he had the nature of a dog.
He has a form.
He has a
just
form.
Yeah.
But so I guess that's the question. Like, was Fido was Fido because he had the dog nature, which is generic in a certain sense, and he had the matter, which is specific to him. Correct?
No, so don't think of it in terms of that. So think about all those parts of Fido. What actually makes all those parts Fido? Because over time, right, like, dogs shed. He gets new hair to him. Like skin cells slop off. Maybe he has his dog appendix out. I don't know if dogs have their appendix out. But anyway, like his matter changes, right, just over time, right? So what makes Fido Fido? So remember last week we said there's a huge problem with when we talked about, like, when you say something like we're just composed of atoms. Well, are we 1,000 things or one thing? So what makes Fido one thing? His form, right? Right? So don't think in terms of like so matter, when it unites to a form, makes an individual, but that's not what makes him individual. Okay?
So you have Fido and Rocket, and they're both German Shepherds. Okay, so they both have this German Shepherds, not speeches, but
whatever. That's
I don't know. They're both dogs, but you're saying their individuality comes not only from the matter, but from the fact that they have their souls are different. How does that work with the fact they both have the same dog nature?
The same way it does with us, right? So the form united to matter is individual, right? But the form separated from matter doesn't exist. But it's not just one or the other that makes it individual; it's both, right? Because the matter with its accidents, it would cease to be a dog if it changed into something else. So the form decides what it is and holds it all together as one thing. But those two things have to be united together.
And then do we change our form as we, like, in the sense that this kind of breaks down with a dog, but human beings, I'm a different person than I was X amount of years ago. Now, obviously, I'm the same person, but I'm, like I said, at the very minimum, there have been accidental changes in who I am.
Yeah, but there couldn't be a substantial change. So you're stuck with yourself.
It's like,
and we're all stuck with you.
But okay, going back to the dog level, Fido is extreme. I'm sorry if I'm just really being this dead dog. But, I guess it's a live dog, still the soul. But so Fido is very curious, and Rocket is scared of things. Why are they different?
Difference in matter.
So their personality still comes from matter.
Well, use the word personality very loosely, but yeah, so they're not persons, right?
Not,
yeah.
They're
just like most of our personality traits come from our temperament, right? That's just a material thing, right? So, your skills and that's all from that's like why it's a subsistent, like it's a substantial being. It's both. Like think about here's a good how is it that that I'm good at math and I give my children, and my children are also good at math, unless it doesn't reside somewhere in the body, right? And not just the soul. So it needs to be careful not to over spiritualize, and we can talk more about that if you guys want, but not to over spiritualize it, right? Because the matter really does matter. Yes, Casey.
So that means when we die, we'll be significantly different. But then at the second coming, when we're reunited to our body, same matter?
Well, do you have the same matter you had when you even walked in here? Probably not. So not the same matter in the form of like molecules and like all of that. But yes, something about the matter such that it unites to the form that is your soul. So it's the same body because you're the same person. And you can never have another body. Like, that's because only that, your body only unites with your soul. Because your soul is the form, makes that body your body. All right? Just like you could never have other parents. You would, if it wasn't for your parents, you wouldn't exist. You can't have two other parents. Yeah. I always love those like parent switching things, or parent and kid switch. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
But don't we? So what about the spiritual aspects of who we are? So we have an intellect, we have a will that is spiritual, like it doesn't reside in any faculty. So how is that, or are we saying all of our wills are the same and it's just habits that change, that differentiate them?
Hold the question.
Got it.
All right, because we're gonna get to that, and then it'll be the answer. Actually, you'll be able to answer yourself. It'll be one of those self-answering kind of questions. All right, one other thing, and there's like 3 or 4 times this semester that I wanted to define these terms because the third is very useful. So we can talk about, when we talk about relationships between things, we can talk about them in 3 different ways. Okay, the first is univocal, which means we use the term in relation to several individuals such that it has the same meaning. Okay, so when I say that Allison is a person and Connor is a person, I mean the same exact thing. Okay, we can use terms equivocally, which means that we've used the same term, but we mean them in very different ways. So think of bank, right? Like, I'm going to take my money to the bank. Well, you're going to go bury it beside a river, or you're going to actually take it to a bank. Okay. But the third is the one that's important, and that's analogical. And we'll come back to this a lot when we talk about natural theology, because it depends upon it. But in it, analogical, just where we get the word analogy, means that when we have two or more individuals, we're saying something is like in them and something is not alike in them. Okay? So when we use the term life and soul, that's an analogical term. Okay? It's not univocal. So when we say that animals and plants have souls and humans have souls, we mean 3 totally different things. But I shouldn't say totally. We mean 3 very different things, but they have some things that are alike. Okay? And so when you use analogies, usually you're talking about things that are not just differences in degrees, but differences in kinds. Okay? And the reason why this is important is because when I say God is good, who knows what that means? We don't really. We have an idea, right? We have an idea what good is, right? And we can sort of escalate it, right? Like we can say that ice cream is good, Fido is good, rocket is good, Joe is good, my guardian angel is good, God is good. Like, so they all sort of mean the same thing, but not quite. Okay? And so when we begin to, and this will come up a lot when we talk about the problem of evil too. But just understanding that when we use life and soul, we mean them analogically, as if they're analogies. Okay? So we'll start with the similarities, and then we'll move to the differences. Okay? All right. So I said that there were 3 kinds of souls, or 3 types of souls, all not just differences in degree, but difference in kind. All right, so let's just look at the powers. And then I have 2 questions that we can kind of unpack, which will tie the distinction between them different, to tie it up together. All right, so vegetative souls have 3 powers: growth, reproduction, and nutrition. Everybody agree that plants can do those things, right? And that we would say that plants that could move around weren't plants, right? We'd say they're animals. And so now we've moved over to animal souls, which now have 3 other powers: sensation, sense appetite, and locomotion. Yes, Connor?
What's the difference between growth and nutrition?
So nutrition would be actual being able to like digest things. Like think of growth would be that they change in size. So not all things change in size through nutrition, right? Yes?
What do we say about plants growing towards sunlight in terms of sense?
Yeah, we would say that is just, what was the word I used before about, I'm drawing a blank on it, when I said that, they respond to stimuli. That's just a response to stimuli, right?
They're not like conscious of the sun.
Yeah.
They don't experience. Okay, yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, being a slide trap to the confusing one.
Yeah, so, and again, like philosophers would leave it to biologists to decide exact categorizations of things like being slide traps, right? Yes?
Where do bacteria fall in all of this?
Well, they're definitely alive, right? I think.
And they move.
Yeah, I think we would probably say that they have sensations. Mm-hmm. So in other words, they bump into things and can feel that they've bumped into things. So they probably have animal souls.
Just like a very low
Yeah.
level.
Yeah. So the lowest of our senses is touch, right? And so a thing that has something like the sense of touch is probably an animal. All right. So when we look at this is the important point. When we look at the rational soul, which is what we have, and we're going to talk about the rest of the time, what we have to make sure of is that we don't think that a rational soul has both an animal soul, a vegetative soul, and a rational soul. All right? Because it has all of the powers of them. All right? So this is where that distinction of the word virtually is. It contains virtually, because what happens is, and people do this, right, what do we call someone who is has brain damage and has lost the use of reason? A vegetable, right? And sometimes people actually mean that, right? They just because these powers aren't operative for some reason, doesn't make them not rational. Okay, and so what St. Thomas would say, he would say that the rational soul virtually contains the other two souls. So virtually just simply means that take like a pentagon, right? A pentagon virtually contains a triangle and a rectangle if you draw a line from corner to corner, right? In it, right? You could get just like water virtually contains hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, even like water doesn't have hydrogen in it, because if it did, it would be very easy to set on fire, right? So it virtually contains hydrogen because I can do electrolysis and siphon off hydrogen. Okay, so that's the idea of a thing being virtually present. All right. Okay, so let me get to like these two questions, and then and I think one of them actually is Connor's question, the second one, and this will sort of help us to understand the interaction between everything I had on that table. All right. So how do we know that that animals don't have an intellect and a will?
They they don't abstract things.
Yeah, and how do we know that?
Because from all our experience trying to teach them, we've never encountered them abstracting something.
Okay, does that give us any assurance, though?
That's a pretty good induction.
Yeah. So I don't know if Connor brings his two friends, Fido and Rocket, in here, and we give them a chair and we make them sit up, are they going to even begin to understand what we're talking about? Okay. Well, any of Fido and Rocket's friends understand. All right. So
Connor.
All right. So Casey brought up one of the things that we'll spend a little time about is the power to abstract. So he says they don't have the power to abstract. How do we know we have the power to abstract? Can we prove that?
I mean, the fact that we're asking the question at all is a pretty reasonable. So it's one of those things that's pretty reasonable to assume, but I don't know that you could necessarily prove it, because we could just be fooling ourselves.
We can think of things we've never seen. Using prior knowledge, we can compile things together into a mental image.
Yeah, which we're going to talk about.
Dictionary.
We're going to talk about that. What about the fact that John Claude answered the question correctly, but he didn't realize he did it? He said we ask. What power goes with abstraction? Language, right? Think about that. Right? So ideas, which are inside of our head somewhere, which will come up in the second question, somehow we communicate those ideas. Okay, so there's plenty of evidence then so for example, a materialist would say there's no such thing as ideas, right? Yet materialism is an idea, right? So just the fact that they have the idea says that. So the point is that language shows that animals don't have an intellect. Okay, there's no examples of them with language. Now, communication is one thing, language is another. Right? So communication is just I'm in heat and make noise, and another animal responds. That's communication, right? But that's not language, all right? But the other way is that I don't get to you guys' question. The other way we know. Have you ever seen a beaver improve on their dam? Right? Like, I don't know how many thousands of years beavers have been building dams, and they're pretty much the same, right? We, on the other hand, we built maybe we started with beaver dams, but now we have dams that are much more intricate, much more effective than all of that. Why does that matter? Like the fact that they don't improve it. And this goes to the heart. This will get us back thinking in philosophical terms. Why does that matter that they don't improve it? Maybe they're just happy with it.
You have to have an idea of some sort in your mind of possible improvements and like an image of the improved object, whereas an animal without an intellect cannot abstract that. They would only be able to think of like an actual dam.
Yeah. So, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the point is, so what did we say about every creature in creation acts to do what? Fulfill their nature, right? And so, what can we say that if a beaver builds the dam the way he has forever, then in some way he's acting to fulfill his nature, which it does not include the power to improve. All right? Does everyone understand that? All right. So we'll get yes, Connor.
So our arguments for why animals are all inductive in a sense that like we look at what we observe and we say, okay, based on these observations, it would not make sense to say they have.
So inductive until you get to the point of what I just said, right? That's pretty close to being deductive, right? Where we go, if you accept the premise that all things act to fulfill their nature, then you would expect to see things act to fulfill their nature, right? Yes?
What's the distinction between communication and language? Because you can argue that just about everything, like bacteria, plants, animals, all can communicate.
Yeah, so communication would just be a form of interaction with something else in its environment, right? Language, though, is the specific sharing of ideas, right? So they don't, no matter what, like a dog doesn't share ideas, right? So he doesn't go to the other dogs and say, the other night I was laying in Connor's lap and I was like thinking, man, I don't understand how they built that couch. Like, and then I started thinking, well, it has 4 legs, and like they don't share ideas, right?
So it's like sharing and communicating their environment and their stimuli or whatever. Like.
Well, so all of their communication, to go back to sort of what Casey said, all of their communication is about like singular things. Like they go enemy, like the wolf is coming after us as sheep. How would they communicate that with the rest of the flock? Whereas. We could plan ahead and go, well, we need to build a wall, and they share the idea of the wall. That's language.
So even like the gorilla who taught sign language is doing, you said, the first thing, not the second thing.
Yeah, they're not. That's not language. Just because they're mimicking. Because the reason why you do that is because they never put them together.
Yeah.
So they don't take. Say, teach them 2 separate words that could be used in a different way, and they never do that, right? You always hear the thing about, like, if you gave, like, a monkey a typewriter, eventually he'd get to Hamlet. But the point is he'd never get to Hamlet because he wouldn't understand when he got to Hamlet. Okay. So, yes?
Is the difference also related to the fact that we can talk about things that we haven't seen at all?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of where Allison was going with it too. Yeah, we can talk about things we haven't, because we can share, even things we haven't experienced are ideas, right? So we can share ideas of experiences of whatever. Yes? Casey.
I was just saying, so like the gorilla thing is like I found to be incredibly helpful when team members like to teach the word to the gorilla. It's all about association. It's saying the word over and over again and holding it. You could never use other words to explain it because they never grasp the idea. It's always a response to the visual or the stimuli. So it's never an ideas thing.
All right, so let's talk about the second question then.
Can you define spiritual?
So spiritual we could use the word immaterial too. I didn't want to throw immaterial up there because it's confusing, but we could also use subsistent as another word. It means it exists without a body. Okay, so Allison is right. She used the really important reason that we're made in the image of God. Could we get there from below, though? Could we get there without faith?
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead, Connie.
I know it has something to do with the fact that certain intellectual processes, and it might have something to do with abstraction, like they couldn't be done by mere material things. I have no idea how you get there, but I think that's. I feel like it has something to do with the abstraction.
Immaterial, I get, because like if you kill something, if you believe in a soul and you kill something and it doesn't change, then you can get to immaterial. I don't understand how you can get to immortal. I'm just.
Okay. All right. So we'll just start with the first. We'll talk about it being immaterial, spiritual. Where are your ideas? All right. What about if someone said to you, no, they're just in your brain? Could you prove they weren't in your brain? So they're just material, some kind of synapses going on in your brain. And this is the sort of the link to get us moving.
Certainly be very useful.
So if something is material, what does that mean?
Does it matter?
Okay, it has matter. You can touch it. All right. So the word St. Thomas would use is it has extension, or think mass, right? So if ideas are material, they have mass, right? Some sort of mass, they have to. Okay. If they're in your brain, we ought to be able to find them, right? And actually, the smarter I get, my head would start to hurt because my brain would start pushing against mine.
But what do you say to the fact that, like, neurological pathways, so it's not necessarily that you're adding more, but you're changing the way things interact to...
But could just pathways be ideas? So, like, where does the idea of a pathway, where does that, if it's a material thing, where does that reside? Like, no one's ever found where it resides because they're looking in the wrong place. But if it has to reside somewhere, right? This is the same thing for a soul, right? If a soul is just some material thing, that means it has to have extension. That means that if you weighed someone, wherever it is in the body, you would be able to detect it in some form of, like, it's here, they're dead, it's not here. So you would be able to measure it in some way. All right? So there's always... something that is material always can be measured in some way, even if we don't necessarily have the tools to measure it. You would expect, though, as someone grew in ideas, you would expect to be in the brain, but you would expect that their brain would likewise grow, right?
So if you look at a computer and the way a computer stores information, it doesn't store information by the amount of matter in it changing. It's the configuration of the matter that's already there. So
But why is there a limit in the memory?
Right, and as far as we know, scientifically, there's a limit in brains, too. It's just huge. Like, there are actually arguments for the amount of data you can keep in your head. I don't know that they've been proven or not, but...
There are also arguments that there is no limit in the memory. What you're talking about there.
I'm just saying, like, I don't see any reason why, if an idea could be stored in your brain, why that would imply that the amount of matter has to change. Because
if something is material, it has to. So
like if I have a pile of like rocks in a jumbled pattern, it means nothing. But if I rearrange them to spell
right.
R-O-C-K, the mass hasn't changed, but now there's an idea contained in
that
there.
idea is not in the rocks.
Yeah, that's not the idea. You're
okay.
just expressing the idea, right?
Yes. So backing up a step, I feel like we're assuming what we're trying to prove, and that's that for something to be material and to be added somewhere, you have to have added something. But my point is, if the building blocks of that material thing are already there, then all you're doing is rearranging them.
Yeah, you're assuming that, see, this is where, like, I think your analogy limps, though, is because you're assuming that what a computer stores is ideas and not information.
We can understand the concept 100 quadrillion zillion power instantaneously. Like, as soon as I say it, you grasp it. And sure, you might be able to get a supercomputer that could, process that information, but it would take a lot. Even then, it wouldn't understand what the concept of that number is.
The only reason anything in a computer makes sense is because we give.
Yeah, there's that part of it too. But I think the analogy you're making.
I think I'm not asking the question I'm trying to ask, which is that I don't see. When it comes to ideas, like, ultimately, when we express ideas, we do so through some concrete example. And the idea that, we just have a lot of those none of us perfectly understand any individual thing.
Mm-hmm.
We grow with the number of examples and abstractions of that particular thing, but none of us could ever say that we fully comprehend Fido.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we don't say that, then I see no reason why we have to assume that ideas are not just physical storages of those different examples that we have.
Because going back to what Allison said before, we have plenty of ideas of things that we don't have examples for.
But there's still
So
connections of things that
you're getting
already
caught up
exist.
with expressions of ideas versus the ideas themselves.
Right, but I'm just saying I haven't been convinced that ideas are a thing in and of themselves from this argument. I'm not saying they don't exist.
Okay.
I'm just
All right, so let's back up to what I was saying then. So if an idea exists, do we
Yeah.
agree that ideas exist since we're talking about them? Okay, so they are either material or immaterial.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so let's assume we'll argue from assuming that they are material
Mhm.
and what that implication would mean. Right. So
But then
if-
you have to define what the idea thing is, right? Because I don't know.
Your point about information versus idea, I thought that was interesting. To say.
Yeah, I mean, a computer can hold a whole bunch of information.
It can't develop information.
Yeah. And it can even, if it's programmed, it can connect things. But it can never come up with an idea. Yes, Conrad.
If we're taking the argument or taking the assertion that ideas are just simply wording of synapses in the brain that spell out Fido, let's just say, 3 synapses, going this way means Fido.
So like a computer, like ones and zeros.
So like 1 0 Since we have the power of abstraction, and I like a unicorn or something like that, I can say, okay, I have this idea of a horse, and I've seen a horn on something before, and therefore I can just put this horn on a unicorn. It seems reasonable to say, okay, there are I'm not sure you can prove infinite, but like infinite amount of combinations of where I can put the horn or what I can mix. I can take a Fido and put a horn on him.
Where do you get the idea of a horse from? Where do you get the idea of a horn from?
Our senses.
So I'm saying, like, if we take that, we just say, okay, well, it's just like a computer with 1s and 0s. That would mean there would have to be a finite limit on the amount of ideas you could have, because there's only so many different combinations of synapses you could have in order to form the different ideas. But if I can theoretically say, okay, well, I can think
Which is where the limit on computer memory comes from, right?
But if I feel like we can think of just conceptually, okay, there are an extremely large number of different, and if I take out everything I've experienced, basically infinite number of different ideas I could.
Yeah. So the word you just threw out just showed why it's not material. You said infinite. Infinite is not material, right?
Right.
If you say something infinite, you've already moved out of the material realm, right? Because there can't be infinite matter.
But you never possess infinite. Like he's saying you could, like there could be.
Well, but he's saying that there's an existence, that he's saying that an infinite number of ideas exist. He's not saying that a person can hold it.
Right, so my whole point is that if you can't hold an infinite number of ideas, then you could argue that your capacity for holding ideas is just, like, from an electron's point of view, like, just a rearranging of what is there until you've rearranged all the unused stuff into used stuff.
Right, but you still got to tell me where that place is and what, and the fact that something changed in it. Like, I can look at computer memory and see what changed, right? You have to be able to look at it, look at the change, the material change that led you to hold the idea. It doesn't matter materially how you're saying you're holding them.
Right.
The point is that you would be able to observe somewhere these material ideas. And the fact that there's no extension, so they don't have extension because there's where are these ideas held?
I mean, we haven't, as far as I know, we haven't proven that when you learn something new, there isn't an observable change in your brain.
There is.
Yeah, there is.
Okay,
Certainly.
so-
It's like neural pathways are certainly.
Okay, so-
But learning something new versus ideas are totally different things. Like,
Then I just feel like we haven't clearly defined idea, because I really don't see the difference.
yeah, so an idea would be to grasp the essence of a thing.
Which means, I mean, again, as far as I know,
So
every time
what
I
a thing
define
is, what
Right.
it's whatness, its form, its nature. right? So,
But we only know those things through things that aren't those.
what do you mean?
Like, I know this is a chair because it has 4 legs and looks like something I can sit on, but I don't know that I could tell you what the wetness of chair is.
Well, you don't have to be able to define it to know what it is, right? So you know it's a chair. You know the essence of that thing. Right? Remember, the essence just says, what is this thing?
I'm having trouble.
Maybe, go ahead. Maybe you can.
So it seems to me like we're getting hung up on where the disconnect is between physical changes and what we as humans experience. So like with intellect and deep brain stimulation, like when you're in brain surgery and the neurologist is poking around your brain, like stimulating certain things, making sure they're not cutting out like the wrong chunk of the brain that they're trying to do the operation on. When they stimulate certain regions of the brain, you don't think differently necessarily. Like your body might have different movement. The I don't know if I'm using the correct terminology, but the matter which you use to think, like your brain can change, but your intellect and your thoughts necessarily don't. Am I following the same line of thinking or no?
Yeah, I mean
the brain is like the medium from which you use your
I mean,
intellect.
it can, which we'll get to.
Right.
It can, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Like, so why don't we do this so we can move? Why don't we just assume for right now that we're starting with the idea that ideas are immaterial? Okay, can we just start there and then we can move from there? I didn't know we were going to get off on a. Okay.
You should assume at a certain point that we're going to find a way to get off on a tangent.
And I got lost in my train of thought again. Okay. All right, so do you guys remember the principle of sufficient reason that we talked about? That the effect has to be somehow in the cause, right? So if ideas are immaterial, what must they come from? If the effect of ideas is immaterial, what must they come from? Something that's immaterial, right? Okay. So we could call that immaterial thing from which the ideas come our intellect, our soul, whatever you want to call it, right? Okay, so that's the spiritual part, so immaterial. And again, hinging on the thing we got stuck on, which we can come back to later. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time hinging on that ideas are immaterial. All right. So if it's spiritual, if it's immaterial, what does that mean? It does not have parts, right? So it can't decompose. So if it doesn't have parts and it can't decompose, can it just disintegrate? Can it fall apart and die like your body? Right? So something that's immaterial can't fall apart. Okay, so what makes it different from an animal soul then?
Animal soul is not spiritual.
Well, yeah, but what? So animal souls cease to exist when the animal dies. Why does our soul still? So we've got half of it, right? We said, okay, well, if it's spiritual, it can't be taken in, it can't decompose, it can't die. But why does it have to be immortal? Why can't it just go out of existence like an animal soul?
But there's
The essence of that thing was never intended to
Well, I mean, that's part of it, but could you give a little more so that, like, someone who doesn't really necessarily believe it could go, oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Because once you start talking about, like, intention, they're like, oh, you're talking about God. Don't do that.
But if your point is that man's soul is spiritual and therefore not decomposable, then if it can't be decomposed, to go out of existence is too...
Yeah, so an animal soul really can't be decomposed either.
Yeah,
it can just
but
cease to exist.
It's just
So
material.
we've got half of it.
It's material. So when the material thing is eliminated,
Yeah, so
there's nowhere else for it to go.
So it depends upon the matter, right? And then if it depends, and we said that the human soul does not depend upon the matter. Now, were we just assuming that, or can we prove it? All right, we'll be able to prove it after we get. So the answer is that there are operations that our soul performs that do not depend upon our body, and so those are the same operations when our body is separated from the soul. that will still be capable of performing. Okay, and we'll talk about what those operations are in a minute. Yes, Con?
So how do we know that something that's spiritual isn't composed of parts? Is there a reason?
Because it's immaterial. So that's the definition of material, right? Material just means that it has extension, which means it can be reduced or expanded.
So there's, I guess, why couldn't there be like spiritual parts?
So parts only make sense in the form when we're talking about matter. Like spirit,
Okay.
like spirit is immaterial, so it doesn't have parts.
And then even if we say, and I'm going to assume we'll prove that there are certain things that our soul can do that are apart from our body, or do not need our body to be able to do them. Does that prove that the soul's immortal, or simply that? Is there a reason we couldn't just say, okay, well, yes, we can do these things, but we're still just going to drop out of existence once our body dies? Or once our soul's separated from our body? Is there a necessary reason that it has to keep on going?
Well, I mean, not in that sense, right? Like it's a necessary. Could be some other way, right? But you can show why, again, inductively, why that is, right? I mean, it could be anything, right? Okay. All right, so let's just talk about the three powers of the soul, and then we're going to jump into each one of these, and then hopefully answer the end part of that question. All right, so you guys know this. To be thorough, we would have that the powers of the human soul are all of those in the right-hand column, but we're going to focus on the last three. Okay, and that's intellect, will, and passions. So the intellect is how we know things, universal things. The will is how it's called intellectual appetite. It's how we move towards things that are good. And then passions are powers, bodily powers that make us do the good vehemently, or move towards the good vehemently. Yes, or repel evil vehemently.
Can we distinguish passions from the fact that, so if someone has a certain part of their brain removed, they just sort of stop feeling emotions?
It's a bodily. So the operative power operates through the body.
Okay.
So if whatever the organ is, or whatever the mechanism is for using those. So in other words, like people have certain temperaments, right? They feel anger much more than other people. That's the same thing, right? Yes, Connor.
So even though they're all powers of the soul, they are not all spiritual powers.
No. So the intellect and the will are the two spiritual powers, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
All right. So I don't want to. What I really want to do, I want to spend a lot of time on the emotions and the passions, and I wish we could do just a whole class on that. But I do want to sort of set the tone for a couple of these. So the intellect, we all sort of know this already. Intelligent beings are distinguished from non-intelligent beings, and that the latter possess only their own form, whereas intelligent being is naturally adapted to have also the form of some other thing for the idea of the thing known as in the knower. Okay, you guys remember hearing this before? All right, you guys remember what that means? Casey, you're shaking your head yes. What does it mean to have the thing, the idea of the thing known is in the knower?
I mean, I feel like what we've been talking about in a different way, the whole idea that like you in a way possess the form in the intellect of...
Not in a certain way, for sure you do. Right?
In a certain... yes.
Yeah, so that all that means is that I can know a thing and it becomes a part of me. Right? So somehow I capture the form of the thing without turning into that thing. Right? So every other thing in this, like, in order to get the form of something, they have to turn into that thing. Right? So for the matter in a rock to become, I don't know, some kind of mineral, something or other, right? It has to take on a new form. But we can have the idea, we can have the form of a rock within us without turning into rocks. That's all that means. So we have the capacity to know all things because we can take their form. So we're united to their form. All right. All right. All right. So let's talk about. You guys already know this. Nothing is in the intellect which was not first in the senses. So let's talk about how we come to know things. All right. All right.
I love it.
Diagrams.
All right. So this would be totally up Connor's alley, probably. All right. How many senses do we have?
5.
Wrong.
Correct.
We have 9. We have 5 exterior senses and 4 interior senses. Okay. And so we're going to talk about each one of them. All right. All right. So something before my eyes, and before my ears, and before my nose, and before my hands. And maybe I'm licking it too, without grossing you out. I don't know. But let's just say something activates all 5 of my senses. All right, exterior senses. All right. So here's the thing. All right, and what's the end game of this encounter with the thing? Like, as a human being, what's the end game of my encounter with anything that I encounter?
To know it.
To know it, right? To turn it into an idea. Okay. All right. All right. So let's go how we go from thing to idea. All right. So it comes in through the exterior senses, and we form this thing called a percept. All right. And a percept is think of it just as an image of the thing. It's constantly changing as I, suppose, I think it's easier to see. Suppose, when I can't see something, and yet my other senses tell me exactly what it is. So, like the common example is like the stick in the water where it looks bent, right? And then I just use my other senses to see that it's not. I run my hand along it, right? And so if I just use my eyes, I might have this percept of it being bent. But when I use my other senses, it's now a stick that's straight. All right, so I have this percept. So all of the sense data goes into what's called the common sense. That's your first interior sense. All right. And what it does is it takes all the data, puts it all together, right? So everything that is purple-ish is animals have, okay? Obviously, the operation of them is a little different, but they have the same powers, okay? All of that comes from our animal, from the part of the animal soul. All right, so if the common sense draws all the sense data together, it forms this percept. While that's happening, the imagination is also active. And it's, again, taking that image, using it, redrawing it over and over and over and over. Okay, each encounter, every minute I see something, moment is something different, something changes about the percept. The imagination then takes this image. Okay, so the percept goes away, but the image in the imagination stays. Okay? And so this image in the imagination is what St. Thomas calls a phantasm. Okay? And then there's this interaction that goes on between my imagination and my memory. So then that image is now compared against images in my imagination. Also that I can go back and say, I can answer what is that thing, right? All this is happening all at once. So I can look at that chair and the image is compared to my memory of chairs and they're compared and my intellect abstracts that and says that's a chair. Okay. All right, so your memory and imagination work together, and then feeding. Think of it in this way: feeding this image to your intellect. Okay, and then the what's called the agent intellect, which is just a part of your intellect, kind of siphons off the particular parts of it, like things that make it that particular chair that aren't really important for knowing what it is, versus its nature, and then takes that abstracted, it ceases to be an image, but that abstracted idea, and then runs it through the process of reasoning. Okay? I don't know how much simpler I can kind of put it. Does that kind of make sense? All right. All right, so let's talk a little bit about then the acts of the mind. Okay, so that's the very last part where you begin to work through the idea. All right. All right. So what happens initially is what's called simple apprehension. So what I do is I look at it, and then the essence of the thing is grasped. So I may not. So I may look at that, and suppose those two chairs were sitting together, and I might initially go, "Oh, that's a couch," right? But then I begin to look at it. So my simple apprehension says that's a couch, right? But then my judgment acts at the same time and says, "No, that's not a couch," right? So judgment always asks, "Is your conception of what it is true?" Okay, so it judges your apprehension of it. And then once the judgment says, yes, it's true, then you begin to reason on it. All right, the process of reasoning starts. And we're going to have an example in a few minutes when we do this. But
Are we conscious of each of these stages, or are you saying they're all happening?
so the intellectual part, yes. This is how your intellect functions. Like this is the... So you if you thought about it for just a second, you would realize this is exactly how I think. Right? My first question is what it is. What is it? And then almost immediately with what is it, is that right? And then you begin to now connect it with other stuff you already know. Okay, so that's just putting words to that process of what I just described. All right, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'm not really telling you anything you probably didn't already, like maybe I put words to it, but something you didn't already know that's sort of how your intellect works. All right. So, and when we get to my example, you'll see why it's important. So, what would happen if it didn't work like this? Like, what would happen if something was broken in the process?
Can I bring up a specific example?
Yes.
Mindfulness.
Okay, that's my example. The answer. No, you can't bring it up.
Dang it! We just had to talk about that at work on Thursday. It made me really angry.
Yeah. So no, you can't bring that up. Sorry. So what would we? What I'm getting at is when we talked about at the beginning about understanding mental health, right? So a mentally healthy person does this, right? Looks at what a thing is, judges it, and then begins to act and reason on it. Okay. And we'll just leave it there since I've sort of already let the cat out of the bag about the example we're going to use. All right, so let's just back up a little bit. Now I want to talk about like what mental health looks like. Okay. All right, so we're going to back up to the memory and the imagination. All right. So, and again, I think we intuitively already know what these things are. So let's just put definitions around them, and then we'll talk about it. So, memory is an internal sense whereby an image is recalled and serves as a medium of intentional existence for an object no longer present to the observer. Okay, so that thing where we bring back up some previous encounter with a thing, whatever it is. Yes, Connor?
So you might be bad. Finish your definition of imagination. I'll come back.
Okay, so an imagination is just an internal sense that it's essentially synthesizes what's coming from the outside with what we already have encountered. Okay, so think of it connecting past and present. Okay, that makes sense? All right, go ahead, Connor. What was your question?
So my experience at this moment right now, where I hear you talking, you standing there. So all my senses coming together. Does this exist in an immaterial state? Like just it's an image conjured by my imagination based upon all these different senses that are coming in?
Yes. Yeah. So when I said animals have images in their imagination, those are immaterial too.
So it's immaterial. But even animals can do it?
Yes.
Okay. I guess.
But because they don't have the power to abstract, they can only do it about particulars, right? Because that's how animals are trained, right? They have memory of what's going on here connected with the past, and I get a treat at the end. So a couple of things about this then. Okay, so these are material faculties. Okay, so they're dependent upon the body. They operate in and through the body. But we're not the only ones who have access to them. And what I mean by that is that demons, this is how they tempt us. Okay? Always through the imagination and the memory. Okay? So they can go in and they can plant an image. Think about temptations, right? They can plant an image in your mind. And the temptation often comes because they know you well enough that if I put this image in Rob's mind, I know where his train of thought will go. Okay? Or they can pull up a memory. Okay? Which is why we always have to be very careful about what we do in the past. And also, be careful about things we see. Okay? So this is why we govern our eyes. But it's also why, okay, so prayer. If we're distracted in prayer, why is that? Any kind of distractions, why is that?
Stimuli in the senses.
Yeah, so if I'm sitting there and my mind is racing, you hear people say that, right? What if we put it in these terms? What does it mean to have your mind race?
Repeatedly bringing up memories.
Yeah, so your imagination is really running amok, right? And yeah, maybe pulling in memories, maybe not. Maybe you may just be connecting one thing after another, right? And because imagination is a sense or a sense faculty, we can actually train it, right? For good or for bad, right? And so what happens if I totally junk out and veg out on movies all the time?
Your brain's full of movies.
My imagination's used to just being fed constantly with images, right? And so it's constantly hungry for images. So I sit down and pray. I can't sit down and pray. All right, that's why. Okay, so distractions always come about through the imagination. And then the way we gain control back of that is to then take control for our mind, for our intellects, to take control of the imagination and begin to feed it images, right? That's why we often need, when you pray, you have to use a book. Most people can't just sit down and pray for an hour without a book or without something, a piece of art or something to feed the imagination, to keep it focused on that so that the mind can then keep processing it, okay? Because there's this interaction back and forth between your intellect and your imagination and your memory. Yes, kind of.
And this is why in the higher levels of prayer, you just start it's quiet in a sense, it doesn't involve your imagination. You're just
yeah, and ideally you don't want it to involve your imagination because that will because you're going to get to a point where you can't imagine the things that are going on, right? And there's no images that will match them, right? So you move beyond God as this old man with a long beard to God, actually working at the depths of your intellect where no image matches it, right? All right, so these powers are again, they're material powers, but so there's something that we have to learn to control. Okay. All right, and we'll come back to it again at the end when we do the little mental health exercise. All right. So you often hear, when we talk about the will, you'll hear it called as an intellectual appetite. And that just means, an appetite is just what you guys know what an appetite is, right? It moves you towards something, right? So the intellect says a thing is good, the intellect moves towards it. Okay? So I think the appetite literally means a tendency toward. Let's talk a little bit about this, and then we'll talk about the emotions. So, what is freedom? Yes, Connor.
So you said when the intellect judges something to be good, and the will moves towards it, right?
Ideally, right? So remember, the will is also getting information because I sort of glossed over this, but it's also getting information from your senses that make it a little cloudy as to what's good, what's not, and so you can move towards a thing that is going to satisfy your emotions, which actually isn't good, right?
Is it the will that's getting the information, or more than the image that's being presented to it is not perfectly intellectual, it has other... JT, I'll get to your question, because this is a good point. So, here's a good example. So, let's say I know that stopping on the side of the road to help someone who's stranded is a good thing, all right? But I did it one time, and I stopped, and the guy punched me, and it really hurt, okay? So then when I see that person again, my memory I see another person, my memory calls that up, and I go, yeah, that's a bad thing, I'm not doing it, right? That's just sense knowledge, right? I just sit there. And so I might then, stop and help him, and this guy might punch me too. And then so I get in my car, I'm like, seriously? This is and so now every time I go by, not only am I, I have this image of it being completely and totally unpleasant, right? And so I won't stop until my will says, no, you must stop, okay? So that's the interaction between the two. All right, JT, what was your question?
I wanted to ask, is the will a conscious power, an unconscious power, or both?
No, so it would be, I mean, in the terms you're using, it would be a conscious power. So it has to be something deliberately chosen,
Okay.
not something that you just, like, I don't know, think in terms, if you're using unconscious and conscious versus, like, if a doctor hits me on the knee and I just naturally, like, knee jerk.
Well, I think when you progress, like, in a level of, like, virtue, you do things, you do the right thing without even thinking about it. It just becomes sort of instantaneous.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what I was going to.
Yeah, but that's still, yeah. So if you're using it in that sense, yes, the virtuous person, the good is easier, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the good is easier because they love it more. And because it brings them pleasure, which we'll talk about in a minute. So it's not, yeah, it is instantaneous, but it's instantaneous in the same sense of, like, when you've been, walking in the desert and someone hands you a bottle of water and you just don't even have to think about it, you're just like, just take it, drink it, right? It's instantaneous in that sense. That it immediately is recognized as a good and you just act. Okay, so, yes, Tom.
But something, would you say, is if I'm walking out of the room, is every individual step willed? Because I'm definitely not thinking, okay, this is a good place to take a step, and that's another good place. It's just but I'm willing the general action, if not.
Yeah, so I'd say, like, that's just the difference between ends and means, right? Like, so if you've willed to go meet someone for dinner, then in essence you've willed to take every step to get there, right? All right, so what is freedom?
The ability to rational being to choose what is good.
Okay.
So I have a specific question about this.
Okay, what is your specific question?
So, deterministic arguments, which obviously this is not.
Yeah.
But how do you separate perceived good from physical, psychological, and social factors? Because we only know things in and through our bodies.
Okay, so let me read the definition and I'll answer your question. So, property of the human will, according to which it in principle is capable of operating without determination by physical, psychological, or social factors, but rather in response to a perceived good. All right, so ask your question again now, specifically.
So, like someone who subscribes to determinism would say that free will doesn't exist because every decision we make is based on physical, psychological, and social factors. Basically, like everything that's happened to you up to this point sort of gears you to make the decision you're going to make. And this says not that, and actually in response to perceived good. But how do you separate perceived good from those three factors, since we only come to know the good through...
Yeah, the word is determination, right? Like, so in other words, the key word is, I mean, those always factor into it, but they don't determine it. So their assumption is that those things always determine it. This is saying when they're not determined by that. Because there are times when, like if someone taped my hand to a gun and made me pull a trigger, right? That's a physical, like I couldn't, there was nothing I could do. I still not will to pull the trigger. But physically, my hand pulled the trigger.
Do you have a contrary example in the opposite direction? That's easy. Of like clearly not physical, psychological, or social factors, but a free choice that is not determined by those three. Because I have trouble coming up with that.
Coming to life today.
But you could argue that that's because I place value on knowing things, or by looking smart, or understanding. Like any of those could be psychological or social.
Why do you put value on knowing things? Is it because you have been conditioned that way, or because you accurately see that knowing things is a good thing and you recognize that?
But
that's the big difference.
But the thing is, I mean, that's the point, but why do I recognize that as perceived good if not by those three things? And if that's the case, then how are those not determined?
Yeah, so I would think the argument against determinism is the fact that I'm arguing against determinism. Like, if determinism is true, then I should have, it should be a perceived good. It should be a determined perceived. Why do I not see it as a perceived good?
I mean,
pride.
That feels fuzzy because there are lots of things that aren't good that we see as perceived good. So
no, I'm saying like determinism. If it is a good, if it is the way things are, why don't I see it as the way things are?
I mean, you could argue the same about why don't people see this as the way things are if it's the way things are.
Well, because they choose not to. Then.
Okay, so maybe I'm choosing not to see determinism that way.
Okay, then you just argued against determinism. You've just chosen something that's not determined, right? You understand what I'm saying?
It was.
That shouldn't be fuzzy, though. That should.
I don't know that it
But
self contradicts though. Like I could. Again, it's
The fact that I can choose against determinism tells me that determinism isn't determined, right?
No.
you can.
I don't.
Yeah, I don't.
You could have psychological reasons why you don't
It
want
could
to.
very much be evil, but it doesn't matter if it's evil if it's the thing, right? Like you would have to then argue like what's good and what's evil, but I don't know that it defeats itself just from that.
Yeah, so I always struggle with things that go against common sense, because if it is determined, then this is the second part of it. Why are they arguing with me?
Right. Yeah.
Like, why are they arguing with me about it if it's already fixed that I have to be this way?
But no, because they can change your psychological.
But it's already determined.
No. Because so if your view of determinism is determined only by your physical and psychological and social factors, they can change your psychological factors in a way that would then make you believe it.
Yeah, I guess changing your mind to me would be, that has to be a free choice. Like the fact that I take evidence and make a different decision, that would seem to be an argument against determinism, right? All right, let's just move past this. I don't want to get hung up on this. Maybe I can come up with a more compelling argument some other time. Again,
Those are questions I've had for a long time, and I've never had.
we can talk about it, and I'll think about it. I don't know. I have no interest in like non-common sense questions, like, because I have found everyone who subscribes to determinism, what they really don't subscribe to is personal responsibility, right? Like that's ultimately what it comes down to. They just don't want to and I just have no interest in like arguing with someone like that. Yes.
Can we do something like this? Because honestly, like the majority of our political and sociological problems right now boil down to that fact, is that people do not want to take responsibility for whatever.
Right.
And that they put the responsibility and whatever that is, money, power, whatever, onto somebody.
I mean, I'm game for that. If you guys, we have a topic at the end. We have a TBD topic that we could talk about. Maybe you guys can narrow the topic. Maybe political responsibility or something like that.
White privilege.
All right. So I want to move. I'm not going to get stuck. I don't want to get stuck on freedom. So we'll just set it aside because we're going to come back to it next week anyway. I was sort of trying to prime the pump. Let's talk about emotions. All right. All right. So St. Thomas calls the emotions passions, and it just essentially you guys all know what emotions are. You know what passions are. Passions are just things that are moved. Okay. In us. And so he breaks them down into two categories: the concupiscible, which are ordered towards some sensible good that we determine is a good as such, and then the irascible passions, which move us for when something is either a good is either hard to get or an evil is hard to avoid. Okay, and this will make sense in just a second. Okay. All right, so let's look at these real quick. The concupiscible, can't say it fast. Passions. All right, so we see some good object, okay, or we see some object, and we have an initial reaction to it, okay, as it is, and so if we perceive the object is good, and we'll talk about how we perceive in a few minutes. We experience the emotion of love, okay? And then as we then move towards it, the emotion we experience is called desire, all right? And then when we receive it, St. Thomas will call this either joy or pleasure. Yes?
Can pleasure be a sense, like as a result of a sense, as well as, so like I'm thinking like consolation prayer. Like it's not so much that you're receiving some good and receiving it, there's just pleasure in the fact of prayer.
I guess it just depends on, so is it the emotion of pleasure, or is it joy, is it, might be both. Maybe when we get to the end of it, it'll make sense, like where that fits in. Okay, so So love is the chief passion, right? So we see something that we want to, some evil that we want to avoid, and we hate it. We experience hatred, and we try to avoid it. That's the emotion of aversion. And then if we get stuck with it, we experience sadness. All right, and we're going to use an example in just a second. Okay, so love is the chief concupiscible passion. It's not really just the chief concupiscible passion, but it's the chief passion, period, because we always move toward what we perceive to be good, right? We always want good. We can't not want good. And so we hate things because they're not good. All right. So, have we done this before? Have we gone over this before? Okay. All right. So let's just say, okay, there's a piece of cake right there. I look at it. I say that cake is good, and then as I start walking towards it, I desire it, and then when I eat it, I get pleasure as I'm eating it. All right. And then let's just say there's a snake right there. I look at it and I hate it, and then I begin to back away because I'm experiencing the feeling of aversion, and then it starts chasing me, gets a hold of me, and then I'm sad. Okay. So that's how it works. All right. So when you're in a situation where you're experiencing evil, you will experience sadness. When you're experiencing what you perceive as a good, you get pleasure. Okay? Yes?
So it boils down to perception, right? Because what if you like snakes and you think they're cute and cuddly and you like to play?
Yeah, so yes. Emotions totally depend upon perception, right? That's why we can take pleasure in something that's not actually good for us.
And we're distinguishing this from the act or...
Yeah, we're totally setting aside
Yeah.
right now. These are just the emotions. So just our response to either some good or some evil that's before us. Okay. All right. So maybe we can get a little example here. So St. Thomas says that the best way to win the virtue of chastity is by fasting. Why is that the case?
You're training your emotions.
Okay, be more specific there. Why fasting? Why not some other way?
You're training yourself to not scratch an itch, essentially.
Use
You're
use
learning to
these-
deal with the desire and not seek pleasure.
Yeah, so hunger and the sex drive are both part of your concupiscible passions, right? That sort of push your concupiscible passions. So that when you can control one of those passions, you can control all of the ones attached to them. All right? So that's why he calls it the guardian of chastity, because when you can control desire for food, which is one of your concupiscible passions, you can also control the desire for sex. Okay, that's why fasting works. So there's psychological reasons why that is. Okay, goes to how we're made. All right. All right. Let's talk about the irascible passions. Irascible passions are when a good is either hard to attain or evil is hard to avoid. And so when the good is difficult to attain, and we think we can attain it, we experience the emotion of hope. Okay, it's emotion different from the virtue, and we'll talk about that in a second. Despair is when we realize we can't attain that good. So notice how before they were opposites to this. They're the same way here, right? Except for the first one.
Can you move back for just 3 seconds?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so when we're threatened with evil, but we can conquer it, that's the emotion of courage. And when we're threatened with evil, but we can conquer it, that's the emotion of fear, which we'll talk about in a second. And then when when the evil is present to us, we experience the emotion of anger. Okay. Yes?
So the irascible appetites overlap with concupiscible appetites, because when you desire something, you could either hope or despair.
Yeah. So these are meant to push you towards something that's hard to get. So desire is not enough. So in other words, my desire to save my life isn't a strong enough emotion to move me to jump out of a window, but fear is. Okay. Yes.
How is anger different from? Not necessarily asking for like on the level of word, but like when you say an anger, so it's a present evil that's difficult to avoid. Can you give an example of like if there's a fire in the building and I was jumping, like I would say I'm angry at the fire that I can't avoid that.
As in, like, angry that it keeps setting?
Yeah. Well, or how about you're at a party and you see a guy hit a girl, like right in front of you. You're like, I'm angry, and you go over and do something, right? That's what it would be. So, in the face of some evil, anger. Christ in the temple, right, experiences the emotion of anger because he's in the presence of evil and does something about it. So it moves him.
And that's going to be after you experience, because first he hated the evil, and then he acted on that through anger.
Yeah. So again, his emotions. It's not the greatest example because his emotions are perfectly controlled by reason, but just in general, right? So it's meant to move us, and often we need that, right? We need to move quickly, and so it moves us.
And so our job is more to do what we can to orient them correctly, so that when they happen, we can respond.
Yeah. So here comes the question. Can we control our feelings? And this is where we'll start to talk about a little bit about tying this all back together.
So not directly.
All right, so we can train them, not directly. Okay, so let's
the right ordering of things, as you kind of just said with Christ, is having the intellect to rule over the passions, so that you can say, a man should a woman, this is the correct moment to be angry.
Yeah, so it's more than just that. So Christ not only did his intellect rule over his emotions, his will did too. So when Our Lady is another example of being perfectly integrated, right? So she wills the sorrow that she feels at the foot of the cross, which means it's greater than if she just felt it. So her ability to feel emotions, because she willed them completely, far beyond what we could possibly feel, because she had perfect control of them. So it was a grave evil, and she's witnessing it, and she feels sadness and sorrow more than we could ever feel it, because she can will it completely. She could have completely shut it off, just like Christ could. Christ could have just shut his emotions off because he had perfect control of them, right? But instead, he's a man of sorrow, so he really feels deliberately chooses to feel emotions,
and he feels exactly what he should feel
when he should feel it. And because there's no self-love in it, he feels it more deeply. Yes.
So when we talk about, Mary could choose not to feel sorry, but she could have just. That's under in the statement that her passions were entirely under her intellect and her will, but because her intellect was entirely, because her will always decided the good, she would always look at the cross, see the evil, and feel sorry. It wasn't so much it wasn't like she could literally look at the cross and just be like.
Yeah, so she had the power to do that, but she obviously never would have, because she, perfectly intellect, looking at it, going, "That's absolute evil," and so in the face of absolute evil, she felt sorry. All right, so back to the question: can we control our feelings? So let's talk a little bit about this. So there's two sort of categories of them called antecedent, which when the emotion precedes the action of the will and induces the will to consent, such as anger or hatred. So I feel something, and then I will to continue feeling it. All right, so just all of a sudden I get angry. I don't know, I haven't eaten today, and somebody steps on my toe, and my initial response is just a snap. And then now I've got this emotion that I didn't necessarily will to be there, but now it is there. So now what am I going to do with it? Okay. So consequent is when I make a free decision. So I'm at that moment, and I say, yes, I'm going to be angry. And then you respond. Okay. Now, why did I feel the emotion of anger because I hadn't eaten because someone stepped on my toe? Can I control that?
So
Say it loud, Alice.
Not directly, you could control it by eating something. Like,
Yeah. So I'm going to say no, you can't control it.
If you train hard enough, I don't know.
It depends on when you're
Having
asking.
stuff on your chest.
If you're asking at the time it happened, could I have changed it? I would say no. I would say in future incidences, by analyzing why it's happened here, you could train yourself.
Yeah, so can I stop that instantaneous thing? You're saying yes, you could. Not in the moment because it's already there, but you're saying...
Not in the moment, but like if I've learned that when someone's yelling, that's something I need to be angry about, for whatever reason that is, I can go to that reason and sort of reorient myself to not recognize that as an evil.
Okay, go ahead.
So does it come down to feelings come to you and then you choose whether or not you entertain them or not?
It doesn't. See, that's where a lot of people will say that, but it doesn't, because the virtuous person doesn't even feel it. So they only feel anger when they should be angry. So think about this. So think about someone who is chaste, right? They are absolutely repulsed by pornography, right? There's no temptation there because they look at it and they're like, "That's disgusting," right? They didn't feel any of the emotion of the emotional attraction towards it, right? I mean, you think about it for all these different. That's the purpose of virtue is not just acting rightly, but it takes our emotions and puts them under control of reason. Yes.
But could that be said because our intellect is more oriented to reality, we see what is good, and therefore what originally was perceived as an evil and therefore ignited our emotions is no longer perceived as, or at least not perceived as...
Well, yeah, so yes, because the emotions are now under control of reason, right? So like the virtuous man or virtuous woman, you could say someone is honest, right? They will just know how to be honest, right? In its given situation, they'll just do the honest thing. Where a moral theologian will take a half an hour to make some kind of argument about why this is permissible versus not permissible, and then they'll argue about it. Like, you don't have to tell an honest person the definition of lying, right? Because come naturally by their experience, they know it, right? And there's no temptation to lie. And then it's the same thing with it. So these emotions, if you can't control them rising, it's because you don't have the virtue yet, right? So virtue is what temperance controls the concupiscible passion. This is another reason to fast, right? It's because it puts our emotions under our control, right? And then fortitude controls the irascible passion, okay, and the irascible appetite, and always orders it towards when it should be ordered, okay. So the person who doesn't have fortitude or doesn't have meekness should not let their anger, they should not even begin to start talking about righteous anger, right? Because they're not meek. Okay? So that idea that we can control our emotions is a cop-out, right? That just means we've got to do the hard work of virtue. All right. So I just said you could control your emotions. So what about things like anxiety and depression? And sorry, I guess I cut off the bottom of the slide.
Saint who is that?
St. Thomas Aquinas. Some guy named St. Thomas Aquinas. So what St. Thomas says is that there's some times where passions are so intense that man loses his use of reason altogether. Okay, so he can't. So remember, we're getting knowledge from our senses, right? And then sometimes we're so flooded by our senses that we can't even use our reason. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this, because I think this is another thing that's not necessarily well understood. So meet someone who has anxiety, and probably 9 people who haven't struggled with anxiety, 9 out of 10 people will say, we just need to pray about it. Okay, you just need to trust, right? So let's talk about what anxiety actually is, all right? And depression would fit sort of the same way. So if we were to go back to our emotions, what emotion are we talking about when we talk about anxiety?
Fear.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be despair, right? Because it's not, so they're experiencing fear, right? So there's some threatening but unconquerable evil.
And the unconquerable is the perceived part.
Yeah, so they perceive some unconquerable, some evil that is unconquerable. Okay, so what we didn't talk about though is that when an emotion is continually fed, it's even more and more hard to. So in other words, someone who experiences fear, say a child who was a kid who was abused as a child, right? And they live in fear of when the next time is going to happen, and their body becomes so conditioned to fear that that's now their default emotion. Okay, so think about that, right? That can a lot of times be like a source of anxiety when people are older, right? All right, so they experience fear. Okay, so the question is, how do they turn that fear off? All right. Often if you ask someone who has anxiety, they won't be able to tell you quite what they're anxious about, right? They know they're anxious, and so what's happening there? So go back to that picture at the beginning. Someone who has fear, what's happening? Or someone who has anxiety, what's happening to them?
Imagination is drawing a picture that's a lot worse than what's actually in reality.
Yeah, so their memory and imagination going crazy, right? So they're pulling up images, pulling up memories from things and so what are those doing? What this isn't doing is these really go two directions too.
Yeah,
so when I imagine something that's scary and fearful, what do I do?
Scared.
Feel fear, right? So now we got this like feedback loop of two things. Okay.
The fear comes in as a external sense again.
Yeah, but they're under the control. So it's an emotion. So it's not a sense, right?
But it can affect subsequent judgments.
Oh, that's the point, right? Yeah. That's totally the point. Is that now you're giving the intellect this thing that it needs to make a judgment on, right? And it needs to make a judgment on whether it is the essence of it is actually a threat or not, right? And then so the reasonable person is like, okay, dude, why are you anxious about that? But the person who's actually experiencing it is like, no, I feel it, and all of my being is saying I need to be scared of this, because every time I see this image and with this memory attached to it, danger looms, right? All right, so this idea of us being body and soul being interconnected, right, is really important for us to understand about this is exactly how, how anxiety, how fear gets out of control.
So when we think of imagination, I can think of, okay, I have this image of a triangle or something in my head where don't think of an elephant, we have this image of an elephant. But you're saying it does even more than that in the sense that, well, let's say I was just really scared of you for some reason. Even though I would still look at you and see you, the imagination is drawing you with devil horns or something like that. It is scarier than what actually, even though I don't.
Right, and so the next time you encounter me, and you see me, and your imagination does that again, you have to either say, "Oh yeah, he's a devil," or you have to go, "Oh no, he's not really a devil," and then eventually the imagination comes under control, right? So this is why, some children who are abused don't have anxiety, because at some point they were able to go, "That's over," right? Rather than, and this is where you get into deep, psychological, PTSD, all those things, where it just becomes. But the point is that you can look at this sort of almost metaphysically or anthropologically and know why it's happening. Okay, and if we're able to know why it's happening, because the imagination really is out of control, drawing up these images that are no longer true, then the question becomes, how do we get the control back? Yes.
Well, as I understand, with anxiety and depression, anxiety is a specific fear, whereas depression is typically associated with lower chemicals in your brain. So, say you have low serotonin and low dopamine, that's going to impact chemical synapses in your brain, and you just don't have the capacity to feel a certain way about a given situation.
Yeah, there can be if we took depression, so depression would be an inordinate the emotion of sadness. Mm-hmm. Now, what those cause, if it's just a chemical cause, if it's only a chemical cause, then they've probably done psychological harm too, because all of reality is viewed through that lens of sadness, right? So, if it is a chemical cause, then there's probably a chemical solution. Right?
And there's also the uncertainty of cause versus effect. You don't know if the chemical imbalance is the cause or the effect of the condition.
Yeah, because the brain can change. Like you experience, like if your whole emotion of, your emotional toolbox is just sadness, that's going to change, the way your brain is and change hormone levels and all that. So yeah, it's the same kind of thing. That there's an anthropological, there's something wrong in the way they process images in their imagination, and the way they judge those images.
There's a genetic link to it too, though, because the primary research that I've looked at so far says that 40% of it has to do with choice, 10% has to do with your environment. I think the other 40% is genetically.
Yeah. So either way, it's not. I don't want it to seem like it has to be it can be someone just predisposed towards it. Mm-hmm. It can be any one of those reasons, but the important point is that in many cases we've moved beyond someone willing it, and so we can't just expect them to as Christians we've got to help walk people through it, and we can't just expect them to will their way out of it. Just cheer up. That doesn't work, right? Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to add that the difficult part here. So you have the thing, and then you have the ideas or the memories that come in and color it and form the incorrect judgment. The really difficult part is that second half is almost imperceptible when you're in the middle of it. You have the external thing, and the memories and the imagination come in, but you're not aware that they're coming in. And so, the judgment that you form to you appears to be only the external stimulus. And the work of getting through this is figuring out that those other things are being injected and what they are. There can be times when you're afraid of something and you can tell it's reminding you of something. You have no idea what it is. And so that's why the disconnect and why this is so hard to perceive. Because there's those extra pieces moving around.
All right, so let's, John Claude brought this up, so let's just talk about mindfulness for a couple minutes. Okay. So remember, we've got a grasp anthropologically on what causes anxiety, right? As far as the mechanism. Okay, so the imagination and the memory are sort of out of control and causing us to judge improperly. And there's a feedback loop between the emotion and the imagination and memory. Okay, so here's one of the proposed solutions. Okay, so Dr. Gregory Botero, he's sort of this. He's a big advocate of what he calls Catholic mindfulness. He took mindfulness out of the Buddhist tradition and tries to wed it to Catholicism. The question is, obviously, can it be wedded to Catholicism? Let's talk a little bit about it. Okay. So he says the goal of Catholic mindfulness is to turn off the interior chatter. All right, so he sort of seems to understand the problem a little bit. So interior chatter, I would interpret, if I were to put it in terms we've used, I would interpret that as your memory and your imagination. Okay? So he's saying, okay, I have to somehow get those back under control. I don't think he really means to shut them down. And so, okay, so that seems to be the goal. Seems to be a worthwhile goal. Is that the actual goal, though? Is the solution in that goal? Or is that a means? It means, okay, so what is ultimately our problem?
Problem.
If we have anxiety or depression, what is our, if we go down to the bare bones level, what?
We're not perceiving reality the way.
Yeah, so all mental illness is not perceiving mental reality. So we are judging incorrectly, right? Okay. All right. So he says this is accomplished by paying attention to the present moment without judgment or criticism. Okay. Mindfulness does not mean turning off the thoughts in your mind, but using them as a door to greater awareness of yourself. This is actually one of the essential differences between Catholic mindfulness and Eastern-based forms of meditation. Okay, so what he's saying, he's trying to sort of defend himself a little bit against Buddhist claims. So Buddhists use mindfulness to shut off their mind. Okay, they use it as a means to just sort of create this blank state. So my question then on everything we talked about is there an anthropological gravity that causes the mind to shut off when you do what he's trying to do? So let's look at what he's proposing. He said, this is accomplished by paying attention to the present moment without judgment. What did we say the problem was?
Perception. That's the whole problem. Right?
The problem is judging incorrectly. Okay? So is the solution Do not judge at all, or is the solution to judge correctly?
Judge correctly.
Judge correctly. Why though? Okay, so what if he says, okay, just don't judge right, just hold on to your thought for a little bit. Why can't we do that? Yes.
This might not be the correct answer, but from what I've read, from like Catholic exorcists and stuff, by shutting off your mind completely, you're opening that up. To
Yeah, that is definitely part of it. Yeah, that is definitely that. So the spirit, I'm just setting it like it's probably a bad idea spiritually anyway. But even just looking at it from a mental health standpoint, what when you shut? What did I say about the acts of the intellect? What do they do? What are they? Simple apprehension, judgment. They happen together, and reasoning. If I try to shut down judgment, what am I doing?
Well, you can't.
Unless
You shut down apprehension.
unless I stop thinking, right? Which is why the spiritual part of it is. So what he's proposing actually creates more mental illness, not less. Because why? Because now you've introduced this disconnect somewhere in the intellect between apprehension and judgment, right? And this is why John Henry Newman said you can't do that. You can't not judge, right? Think about it. Everything that comes at you, you're like, is that true or not? True or not? True or not? Right? And so ultimately, I would say that that not only is mindfulness is probably a spiritual pitfall, but I think anthropologically it doesn't work either. Yes.
So when you're aware of an error in judgment that's causing something, but you don't know yet how to judge it correctly, what's the transition look like? It's not turning it off, but is it like judging it and then judging it again and then judging it and comparing, or?
Yeah, normally that's where counsel comes in, right? So, like the part about St. Thomas where he says like reason is shut down, like a lot of times, like if you talk to people who are high anxiety, sometimes you just have to be the voice of reason, right? And just like because they'll just ask, like, well, it's not really this way, is it? And you'll tell them no, and then they'll ask the same question again and again, and you keep telling them no because they've lost the capacity to judge correctly. So that's what counseling does, right? Counseling should be moving you back towards judging reality, right? To go, again, using my example of the abused child, like you're safe now, you're in a trusted place, and that needs to be constantly reinforced so that it changes the way they judge. So it doesn't happen like that, but it also doesn't happen by just going, don't judge.
Yeah, I think when a lot of people say don't judge, this is funny because that's the exact definition they gave. The secular mindfulness coach gave that definition
of what
of mindfulness, like
paying attention
to the
present moment.
Yeah.
That came right out of his book.
Yeah, and so that's not the difference between Catholic mindfulness and Eastern-based forms. So, but I think when a lot of people think they're not judging, they're just judging everything as the same. Because you can't not judge.
Yeah, well, the only thing you can do is stop looking at them. Like,
but if you're paying attention to things, then you're paying attention to things that are happening, and so you're judging that they're happening.
Yeah.